trauma response, the brain and body connection. And yeah, very excited to have her with us tonight. So thanks, Cory, and you can take it away.
Perfect.
Thank you, Donna. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. Trauma is a passion of mine. It's over the last 20 years, I've worked in a lot of different settings. I've worked in the adult community mental health setting. I've worked in the treatment foster care setting. I've done outpatient therapy with youth who have sexual acting out behaviors or we're involved with the youth justice system. I've done outpatient therapy, and now I'm doing what would be close to clinical supervision in our CCS program, working with the community members here in La Crosse County. And so tonight I'm hoping to just share what I've learned over the years, hopefully make some sense out of trauma and how we approach treatment these days. I am happy to take questions along the way. Full disclosure, I did not time this training. So my hope is that there's enough content and not too much content, but I'll adjust as we go along here so that that everybody's questions get answered and that the information gets shared. So I guess we'll just launch right into this. Let's see. Okay. Oh, I don't think that's the screen I want to be on. Here we go. All right. So what I hope to accomplish by the end of the hour is that you'll understand what the identified trauma responses are in the field currently, what the body does to ensure physical and emotional safety, how that affects both brain development and future adult wellness. And going to talk a little bit about some theories and theorists who have contributed to how we understand trauma now. And then finally, my hope is that we can talk about something called dosing as a means of ensuring successful use of coping skills. So we'll just jump right in. What is trauma? I have a nice little definition here, but trauma is defined, I think, more simply as something that is an event that affects somebody usually beyond the experience and has some effect on their functioning later on. And so those experiences range from anything to all the forms of abuse that people experience, accidents, natural disasters, poverty, race, sexuality, orientation, all those things can be traumatic depending on how distressing those interactions and events can be. So in our clinical world, we have identified now 4 different types of responses to trauma. It used to be just fight and flight. I think a lot of people are familiar with that phrase. It's something we use interchangeably with some of the other responses. There's 4 in total. So we'll go through each one of these responses and talk about what its purpose is and what it might look like in modern times. So flight is one of the responses. Flight is characterized by an overwhelming sense to get away, to escape whatever the danger is. And that could be the trauma itself. It could be a trauma trigger. It could be a trauma reminder. And what escape looks like is literally escaping, leaving and getting away from the trauma. It can also look like avoidance. I think those are the 2 ways that I really see trauma pop up amongst the populations I've worked with. But there are certainly other ways that flight can present itself. Perfectionism, anxiety, micromanaging are just a few of the ways that flight presents itself nowadays. When we think about these things, you know, we often hear that back in caveman days, this flight response would have been seen as literal running away because the danger was so imminent and it was right there. As time has gone on and things have evolved and our brains have evolved, we have different senses of danger now. And so this looks different in our modern times. Our trauma response, the second one, is fight. This is also, I think, a pretty familiar one for folks in that when that fight response is engaged and triggered, it often leads to physical or verbal confrontations to defend ourselves against the danger, the trauma reminder, or the trauma trigger. And so we often see, especially in our youth, sometimes in our adult populations, that people will physically fight as a response to experiencing danger or being caught up in something dangerous that feels dangerous, is perceived as dangerous. It can look like defensiveness, really challenging behavior sometimes to get around. This too can look like avoidance in different ways, probably more looking like ambivalence, and can be very demanding. These clients, community members, recipients, consumers, we have different names for the people that we serve, and it can look very different depending on what the trigger is and what the trauma is. So it's good to kind of keep these behaviors in mind as we try to figure out what the responses are that will help us with the treatment later on. The third category is freeze. There's some debate in the field about freeze responses. Some folks in the field say that a freeze response is a response that is an actual response all in and of itself. There's another camp of people that believe that the freeze response is something that happens with the fight, flight, and the fourth response, and that it's necessary in order to choose one of the other responses. I think it's a little bit of both. And so what that looks like is sort of that freezing in place and just really like not knowing what to do. Physically, it can be the body stopping itself. That is often to reassess whether fight, flight, or fawn is needed in the seeking of safety. The cognitive part can happen too with this trauma response, meaning that folks can shut down. The cognitive processes get overwhelmed and they just kind of stop. And so it can look like kind of spacing out or not knowing what to do next. It can also look like daydreaming. I think folks who are, that this is more likely their response, a more ingrained response for them, tend to isolate and tend to like to be alone because then there is no need to really react to the environment or react to the people around them. It keeps them from having to have those experiences. And in some of the research, I found that those folks who have those sustained freeze responses over time, that can often be a result of not being able to complete the fight or flight process as an infant or child. So thinking about this, a baby crying in their crib and wanting their parent and can't get that need met on their own, they might want to escape the crib to get to someplace quote unquote safer, but because they're an infant and immobile and their development doesn't allow them to escape, that might become a trauma for them ongoing that then results in the freeze response. And that can be difficult too. It can be difficult to help people see the value in relationships, the value in feeling our feelings and not getting stuck. And some of those means of escape can become addictions. And so this is a category of response that is unlike the other ones in that way. And the fourth response that is fairly newer, we call it fawn. And this is characterized by a sense of constantly needing to please others to avoid conflict or harm of some type. So this is different than just somebody who might get a reward from achieving or a reward from pleasing people and performing. That's something different than what this is. This is really that trigger response, that safety response of placating in order to stay safe. And so what this looks like is a lot of stuff, a lot of loose boundaries, codependency, an inability to say no, few to no boundaries, ignoring your own needs in favor of others. A lot of resentment and fear of rejection have come from sort of basing our safety on whether or not somebody else is pleased. And so I just want to pause here and see if there's any questions, if folks have examples of real life things that they've seen. I would make a note here that I would say that most people don't engage in one type of trauma response. I would say that the trauma response is based on what the trigger is. So in some cases, you might see somebody avoid or escape one situation, where in another situation, they might fight or defend themselves. So yeah, I want to pause a second and give people a chance to ask questions, to make observations, or just share their own experiences.
Well, Cory, I would think that any of these 4 responses could be negative as well as positive, depending on what the trauma is and how they're stuck in that category. I mean, it would be real bad for someone to keep fighting every time they feel there's a need for response, or fleeing responsibility every time, right?
Yeah. Say more about what your thoughts are behind that.
Well, I see people all the time that get themselves in trouble. I know that trauma can be from one event, or it could be, ongoing series of events, like the soldiers in a war situation, or a person in a domestic abuse situation. So I would think that these responses could be ingrained, and they'll be stuck in one or another, or whichever ones, and they may be very negative no matter which one they're in, or respond inappropriately.
Yeah, and I would venture to say that most trauma responses do not result in what we want it to result in. And the struggle is knowing how to get out of then those fixed responses. We don't want our danger alarms, we don't want our trauma responses to go away, but we want them to be working in a way that keeps us safe from real danger, rather than that perceived danger that can often develop over time based on our traumas. And we'll talk a little bit more about number of traumas and when traumas happen, and how that relates back to our responses throughout our life cycles. So thank you for that. Other comments or observations, questions? All right. So when these trauma responses occur, it's preparing our body for something. It's preparing our body for a response. And so a lot of things happen kind of all at once. There are numerous things that speed up, like our adrenaline, some things that slow down, some bodily things, systems, kick into gear, and others go offline. And it's all for a reason. And that's what I'm going to get into here next. So for example, our stress hormones release to prepare us for action. So that adrenaline starts pumping, the cortisol, the stress hormone, all of those start flowing into the body. Our heart rate and blood pressure increase to deliver oxygen and nutrients to our large muscle groups. It's preparing that release of hormones is preparing our large muscle groups to react. So whether that's fleeing, whether that's fighting, whether that's hiding and staying in place. And now we have fawn, which doesn't play so much into this as maybe some of the other reactions. Blood starts to move away from the surface of the body. And it's taking that energy, it's taking that blood and moving it to the parts of the body that need it in this moment to react. And so that can result in pale, sometimes clammy and flushed skin. And it can be a combination all over the body, because the blood rate and the heart rate need to change as the body reacts. Our pupils dilate. Essentially, our eyes get bigger so that more light can come into our peripheral and straightforward vision so that we can better assess safety and danger as the danger is happening. We're looking for ways to get ourselves safe. So I imagine if you've worked with some clients or community members or yourself, if you experience some hyperarousal, your eyes are probably dilated a lot, where you're just constantly kind of surveying the environment, and that's the purpose there. Our muscles begin to tremble and shake as that adrenaline and cortisol get pumped up and ready to execute the large muscle groups and to fulfill one of the 4 reactions, trauma reactions. Pain sensors are also dulled because if you're injured, the body kind of says, you don't have time to stop and attend to that because we're still in danger. We'll attend to that later when you're safe. And so those pain sensors will be dulled for about 20 to 60 minutes post experience. It takes the body that long to re-regulate itself, to bring down those cortisol levels, bring down the adrenaline levels, get the blood flowing in a way that it normally would be without the trauma response. And that takes some time. Now, with folks who have experienced longer term trauma, we know that after being dysregulated, after being triggered, it can take up to 72 hours. So there are times, especially when working with children, that we would see something happen on Monday and on Thursday, they would still be acting out. And it would keep people scratching their heads about like, well, that was almost a week ago now. Why are we still reacting? It's because their bodies have been trained to hang on to that stress response rather than to let it go. So that's a big range between 20 minutes of coming back down to baseline and 72 hours. That's a big range for folks to come back into their bodies. And then executive functioning goes offline. And what I mean by that is those higher level brain function. So that those are things like organizing, decision-making, planning, judging right or wrong, impulsivity, being able to manage and control that. That's all that executive functioning, which resides, here in the frontal cortex. And a lot of what's happening during trauma will happen back here in the amygdala of the brain, and that is our danger. You'll sometimes call it, here it called the reptilian brain, but that's really where our danger alarm sits and is the thing that activates when we're sensing danger. So when that goes online, pretty much everything else goes offline, including our language center. It's called Broca's area. And this area of the brain shuts down because we don't have time to cognitively process all that's going on around us. I like to give the example of crossing the street. If I'm standing on one side of the street, I look left, I look right, I see what's going on, and I make a judgment about when I can cross. It's all kind of automatic. My brain doesn't stop and go, well, that car is 200 yards away going 35 miles an hour. That car is 50 feet away going 25 miles an hour. I'm a 200-pound person crossing the street at 1 mile per hour. We don't do the physics, right? We don't do the math when we're in a dangerous situation. Our bodies react and our minds react to keep us safe. And so that part of the brain shuts down because we don't need language at that time to keep ourselves safe. We're not going to talk the car into slowing down. We need to react. We need to move our bodies so we don't get hit by the car. And so over time, when people have experiences that are traumatic and have more than one experience that is traumatic, this happens over and over and over and over again in the body and can start to have some real effects on brain development, physical conditions, and how likely we are to be able to change those things. Or are we so far into a fixed state that now we're into a personality disorder? And personality disorders do have hope for change. I know historically there's been an idea in our field that personality disorders are not treatable. I would argue against that. I think there is some skill building and things that can be done there. And a lot of personality disorders are a result of sustained developmental, historical, ancestral, familial, generational trauma. Which is a different presentation. But I'm going to pause here. Does anybody have questions about what the body is doing and how that might have an effect? Sort of just kind of getting that flavor of what this might do to the brain and body over time.
Cory, I have a question.
Yeah.
As a lay person, if we come across someone that's going through these things, what's the best thing that we can do for that person?
Yeah, that's a great question because I wanted to make that point. So I'm glad we're making it now because I might forget. I think the research shows that when trauma responses are able to be enacted all the way through until we come back down to baseline, you have a higher chance of not having that trauma stay in your body. And so if you see somebody in these states, the thing to do is to not try and get them to stop having a response, but to allow the response to play itself out. And I know that can be a scary thing if we're talking about kids who like vacate school, or somebody who might be suicidal and saying, I'm going to go run in traffic, like those sorts of things. You know, if somebody can't keep themselves safe, then I would definitely say somebody else has to intervene. But if the response feels manageable and not life-threatening, I certainly would allow those trauma reactions to process, because what happens and what we know is when the trauma responses haven't been able to play out and folks haven't been able to have that time to come back down to baseline, that gets stuck in their body, that response gets stuck in there, and that it really starts to cause longer term problems for people, and it starts to actually physically kind of change the brain and the body to adapt to all of this excitement, all of this activity, all of this stuff that for most people should be a one-time event, and then we can move on. And that's just not true. We see it, you know, we experience it. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes sense. You know, you're just there to make sure that they're not going to injure themselves or get hurt anymore, and just let them work through it.
Yeah,
Not try to talk them out of what's happening.
exactly. I think that's a lot of what we end up doing when we're trying to be a helper, is trying to get the scary or dangerous thing to stop happening. And really, you know, obviously, again, you know, we want to keep people safe. And so if it's a matter of my escape is going to be a suicide attempt, that's something we would want to intervene on. But if it's something like, you know, every time you get in a fight with your teenager, they leave and come back half an hour later, I would say that's probably okay, as long as they're being safe while they do it. Any other observations or questions about this part? All right. So when this happens over time, and it happens over and over again, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, he wrote a book called The Body Keeps Score, and he has done lots of research from the 70s on PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. He's a neuroscientist, so he's done a lot of studying of the brain, and he currently is doing research on how psilocybin, MDMA, psychedelics, and cannabis can be tools to be used in healing trauma. It's very controversial, as it would be. But he's a great resource to the trauma community. And one of the things that he says is that each of those adverse experiences, every time we experience that trauma response in those ways, it's starting to rewire the brain to be more sensitive. And so oftentimes, you know, we have teachers, we have parents, we have other folks, relatives, friends, employers going, I don't know what happened. One minute they were talking and laughing, and the next minute they had this response. And because we have evolved to not have to fear saber-toothed tigers and mastodons, perceived danger has really become more our sense of danger in our modern times. And so that means more sort of emotional danger, slights and grudges and negative self-talk, and all those sorts of things turn into danger for folks and lead to those trauma responses then that we talked about in the beginning. And so the brain starts to get rewired, and it causes the brain to be in that state of trauma response either more often, more intensely, or for longer periods than is needed. And what I mean by that is for longer periods than the danger is present. So the danger is present for 5 minutes and we have a trauma response for 72 hours. Those two things are not compatible. We should have shorter responses for shorter traumas. But what happens is the brain gets practice in responding without correction, without guidance, without recovery or treatment, without being able to be played out. And so that brain starts to get trained and rewired to be far more responsive than it would be had the trauma been able to be, the trauma response been able to be played out to its end. And so that's when we start to see people who are avoidant. You know, we can categorize their personality as avoidant, or we can categorize their personality as dependent. And it's because their brain has been wired to seek safety in these ways. I like to talk about trauma a lot as brain science, brain health as a brain injury, because it does significantly impact how the brain operates, how we operate in the world, how we see ourselves, how we see others, and how we see the world. It can have a tremendous impact on those things. And that directly relates to our life satisfaction, and how satisfied we are with the life that we're living. So why is this important? Why is it important to know that trauma gets stuck in our bodies, that, you know, the more it happens, the probably worse off in terms of wellness overall that we are? One reason is that it affects our physical health, and it increases our incidence of physical, mental, and substance use health. And so this is something called the ACE study. This was done, I believe, in 2009 out in Spokane, Washington initially. And it gathered information about kids in school and how those kids were learning, how their adverse childhood experiences were affecting their ability to learn. And then they followed them and found out that those folks who had one or more adverse childhood experience had a higher likelihood of chronic health disease and chronic mental health and substance use issues. So I have a little video here that I would like to show that just explains more about the ACE study and about what the ACE study found. And then we'll talk a little bit more about Wisconsin's results of the ACE study. Is anybody familiar already with the ACE study? Maybe I have a little more to explain than I do about it, or have a different view of it.
Well, you know, from my perspective, we've been getting training as judges in adverse childhood experiences and what to look for to try to be aware of these people coming in with issues that may underlie what's going on with them and things that should be addressed to help them get better mental health. But, you know, there's also adult adverse experiences too. They could start as an adult, maybe they never had a childhood one, but just to have more people aware of the fact that so many people are going through trauma and it underlies so many issues You know, a lot of people can function with it, but like I said, they can have poor physical health. A lot of times they act out. A lot of times it's underlying their decisions when they commit crimes or substance abuse, all those things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing to see the effects, you know, of maybe one or two adverse experiences in childhood and what an impact it can have later in life. And I'm hoping that's what this video will show us a little bit of. And then I really would like some conversation around this and how people are receiving this information, because it's pretty impactful, but we'll see what you think. So let me see if I can share this screen here. All right, are we sharing again? Yep, looks like it.
What does your parents' divorce have to do with your risk for heart disease? If your mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up, are you more likely to suffer from depression as an adult? Here's what you should know about ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, extremely stressful events that can happen to a child growing up. Some experiences are so stressful that they can alter brain development, as well as the immune system, increasing the risk of lifelong health and social problems in adulthood. The term comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, landmark research that shed new light on the root cause of everything from stroke and liver disease to substance abuse and mental illness. In the late 1990s, an epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control and a preventive medicine doctor at Kaiser Permanente set out to understand the association between childhood experience and lifelong health. They asked over 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego about their health history, as well as difficult questions about their experiences growing up. Anda and Felitti tallied up 10 different kinds of adversity in this largely middle-class and college-educated population. They were stunned to see how common ACEs were. 21% of all respondents were sexually abused as children. 19% grew up with someone who suffered mental illness. 28% had been physically abused. And 2 out of 3 respondents had experienced at least one ACE. The researchers next looked at how someone's ACE score, or the number of adversities they experienced, related to a wide array of serious health and social problems. They saw that the more ACEs someone had, the greater their risk for poor outcomes compared with someone with no ACEs. Someone with an ACE score of 4 had twice the risk of heart disease and cancer. Someone with an ACE score of 5 had an 8 times greater chance of being an alcoholic. And those with an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years earlier. With every major problem they looked at in the ACE study, the risk went up for each additional adverse experience in childhood. As Dr. Robert Anda says, what's predictable is preventable. It's important to remember that ACEs are not estimates. ACEs are a tool for understanding the health of a population as a whole. For individuals, an ACE score can be a tool for understanding their own risk for health and social problems, and empower them to make changes for themselves and their children. ACEs tend to get passed down from generation to generation and are common across all income levels, races, and cultures. But increasingly, people of all different professions and backgrounds are coming together to discuss how ACEs affect their communities. They're finding new ways to treat and prevent ACEs. Many doctors are starting to screen their patients for ACEs as part of their medical history. More schools are becoming trauma-informed, considering the source of problem behavior when disciplining their students.
I think I have an internet problem.
Suspending or expelling them. To learn more about interrupting the cycle of adversity and improving health and well-being for the next generation, please visit kpjrfilms.co.
All right, so there's probably a better explanation of ACEs than I could give you on my own. Any feedback about that? Anything that seemed surprising or new?
Well, I think there's a lot of preventable stuff if you know what is out there. But the stigma of mental health issues, keeps people quiet. They don't share.
Yeah.
They don't want to look at themselves. They're reluctant to get the help. A lot of times when they want the help, it's not ready when they're ready, and they have to wait and to go back to their old ways.
Mhm. Yeah, our system needs some help for sure, our mental health system for sure, and our substance use system, especially here in Wisconsin. I saw Tracy and Jenny had their microphones off.
Yeah, I was just good. Sorry.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Thank you. I was just going to say, I work with clients every day with mental health issues, whether it's the parents or the children. And I think, that video was just great. The big takeaway is, I guess, that whole, it doesn't have to be your destiny. And, you can, you can prevent. So if you can work through some things and understand things better, just knowing more and understanding it can be helpful. And there are a lot more resources now than there ever has been. Yes, there are system issues and things like that, but there is still a lot that people can do and that families can get help with. And so we're really, really fortunate in a lot of areas too. So I like that they said, it doesn't have to define you. It doesn't have to be your destiny. I know there's a lot of judgment and stuff around mental health. I try as hard as I can to make it real for people to just, telling stories of real people. Like they think, oh, like I'm a social worker. Oh, you have it all together. You're this or that. Well, I have my own ACE score. So like let's talk about that. Figure out, because those kind of things matter to people. Like, oh my God, what, you?
Yeah, they can relate some of that
Yeah.
trauma bonding. Yeah, thanks for the comments, Jenny.
Yeah. Sure.
Tracy, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say that as a teacher, we've had lots of trauma-informed care training. And so we have seen the ACEs and things. But we adopted a child that was severely abused and neglected. And so she had an ACE score of 9. And just how it affects her, this happened when she was a baby and she's 20 now, and how it affects that frontal lobe and how she makes decisions and the poor decisions that she makes. And
you can see it.
Like it's not her destiny, and I hope that she figures that out someday.
Yeah.
A lot of growing and we've learned, the whole family has learned a lot about ACEs and trauma and how that does affect who you are.
Yeah, precisely.
I love that the teachers have now become more informed about it. So.
Sure does help. It helps when all of the places that touch a person's life are sort of on the same page, and kind of understand the same language and the same reasoning behind why somebody might be doing what they're doing, or why they might be getting into fights every day and having disciplines every day, or why they're hiding in the bathroom every day or not coming to school even. So thank you for sharing your story. I think that helps just put it right into real life with people that we know and people that we care for. So I appreciate that. Thank you. I think I got a couple more slides here. So let's just see if we can get through these. Whoops. We already talked about all that fun stuff. Okay. So as Tracy said, that was a great segue. It also depends on when it happens. Dr. Bruce Perry is also another theorist who developed the neurosequential model of therapeutics. And that's a really fancy way of saying the brain learns in a way that builds on itself. And so the brain develops much like you would build a house, with a foundation, with a floor and walls and that structure. And then you fill in, you know, with the drywall, what have you, and then you decorate it. And that's sort of why I like to call brain development is we start in utero. That brain development really starts in utero, and trauma can occur in utero. I think some of the questions you saw in the ACE video were things like, you know, did your mom grow up in an abusive relationship? Was she in an abusive relationship while she was pregnant with you? That matters because that influences brain development. And so when these traumas occur and the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response can't be followed through on, again, the brain starts rewiring the regulation in the brain. It starts to rewire people's abilities to relate to each other and have relationships. And it rewires their ability to reason, to much like her organization and planning and decision-making, problem solving, all those sorts of things. And so much like the video again said, this is not their destiny. And Dr. Bruce Perry has a very brain-focused way to repair, heal, and recover from our traumas. Dr. van der Kolk also says that trauma is experienced at a sensory level. So this kind of takes Dr. Bruce Perry's theories about how the brain develops and Dr. van der Kolk's theory about how trauma is experienced. And we bring those together to talk about rewiring the brain from the bottom up, from the basement up. Because the brain develops in stages, if we miss a developmental point early on, it's going to continue to give us trouble as we grow, and we won't be able to scaffold or build other skills on top of those until those lower brain functioning needs are met. And so that foundation of really sensory oriented experiences. So we talk about eye contact and skin to skin touch and getting your hunger and your toileting needs satiated as infants. And it all really starts, you know, in utero, where we're getting good nutrition and calm and quiet in our environment and low stress in mom. And so the treatment is at that sensory level and at the brain level. And this is true for any age group. I would not say that this is limited just to kids. I would say this is very true for all age groups. And it's something called dosing. And this is dosing, thinking about dosing much like we would think about medication dosing. When we have a viral infection, or a bacterial infection, excuse me, a doctor will often give you antibiotics and tell you to take them for the full course, even if you start to feel better, because that's what your body needs to fully recover from that infection. So dosing is much like that, where you're prescribed coping skills to use throughout the day to practice those regulatory and sensory oriented activities to start repairing that brain, that lower brain functioning. That danger alarm starts to get more regulated and not as sensitive. And then the brain has the capacity to build into those higher functioning places. Dosing is really cool, I think, because you can do a lot of activities, and I will show you some examples of that. It is not limited to any one activity or any one type of activity. You can individualize these dosing plans and schedules for folks that are that you're working with, and according to what their strengths are or what their sensory needs might be. And then we can adjust that for how much they need and when they need it and where they need it and what the most important times of the day would be to need it. The point is of dosing is that we get that practice. And what we have learned about the brain is that when it's in that fight, flight, and freeze moment, it can't access the memory of the coping skill that you learned 6 weeks ago in therapy. It has to be practiced in order for it to be attainable when you're in that fight, flight, and freeze, because our brains go offline. For the most part, our language center goes offline, so we might not even know the words for the skill that we want to use. Our reasoning goes offline, so we can't reason ourselves out of a fight by saying, walk away, walk away. We just don't have that access in our brain, anybody, when we are in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn stage. So what it takes is practice. It takes practice, much like it would, when somebody's practicing a 3-point shot, they do that before they need it in the game, because so much is going on and they're thinking so quickly that they want their body to just automatically react and know what that feels like to hit a 3-point shot. This is the same idea. We want the brain to know what it feels like to use a skill so that it's there when we hit our fight, flight, freeze, or fawn stage. Excuse me. And so we come up with what we call sensory diet checklists. This is a dosing plan. As you can see, maybe not, it might be too small, but as you can see, there's a category for movement, touch and temperature, listening, looking, smelling, and tasting. And then there are some additional questions here about music that's calming, alerting, the lighting. Are there other things that can help? And then what are the top 5 things out of this whole list that you could see yourself practicing to use when you're distressed? And so you can take this list, you can work with somebody and come up with a plan together for what the dosing is going to look like. Now, Dr. Bruce Perry recommends that generally doses are 5 to 8 minutes long and that they occur 7 to 10 times per day in order to be effective for when we need it. They shouldn't be used as reward and punishment. That sets up a whole different system and rewires the brain in a different way than using these as medicine. And that's how I talk about it. This is medicine. We wouldn't say you had a bad day at school and now you don't get your bedtime medicine. We would say you had a bad time at school. It's really important that we take your bedtime medicine so you get a good night's sleep and you're ready to go for the next school day. I probably forgot to mention that I worked with kids a lot. I've been giving a lot of youth examples. This is another checklist. These categories are more about the stage of brain development that is needed. So the sensory would be that very lower brain part. Self-regulation would be sort of that midbrain. Structure and focus comes a little higher up, and then relational work is often needed. That prefrontal or frontal cortex is often needed for relational experiences to be successful. So I'm not sure where we are with time. I had some examples here, but I think we're getting close to the end. So I wanted to leave some room for comments or feedback.
You're doing fine for time.
For time, okay. These are just 2 quick little things. Sarah's 9 years old and struggles to stay in her seat during class daily. She often is seen wandering around the room, distracting other students and singing to herself. When asked to sit at her desk, she escalates to screaming, crying, and throwing objects around the room. She once injured another student when she threw a chair. She has shared that she loves crafts and spending time with her new kitten is her favorite thing to do when she's home. When would be good times to schedule dosing for Sarah? What might be important times for Sarah to practice skills that keep her calm, focused, and ready to work? So we would be looking at 7 to 10 times in a day. So we have lots of opportunity to choose from, lots of time in the day to choose from. What time of the day might be a good first dose?
You're supposed to get her calmed down before she goes to school.
Yeah, make it part of her morning routine, right? You're brushing your teeth and you're brushing it to the beat of the song. That is a dose. If you're being mindful and intentional about it, it can be a dose. So yeah, part of her morning routine. How about once she's at school, what might be good times or a time to offer a dose to Sarah?
Prior to being asked to sit still at her desk.
Yeah, so giving enough time to kind of give her a sensory experience. It could be, let's go in the hallway and do 25 jumping jacks real quick, and then we're gonna go sit in her seat. That's a dose. I know 5 to 8 minutes doesn't probably equate to 20 jumping jacks, but we got things to do too. And so we fit it in how we can, right? Ideally, we would have a 5 to 8 minute activity. But that's not how life always works. So what about any other time of the day during the school day?
At the time she's asked to sit at her desk to have an activity.
Yeah, an activity waiting for her at her desk. So it's a regulatory activity right before she's asked, and then it's a regulatory activity when she complies and does the activity, the request. She complies to the request, to keep her sort of calm and keeping that brain regulated while she's in her seat, so she can start to pair those feelings and experiences together. And I would say anytime she does a transition where she is in and out of her seat, so around lunchtimes, recesses, any sort of bathroom breaks, that there's a sensory opportunity or a dosing opportunity before she's asked to sit in her seat again. Let's try Robert. Robert is 53 and struggles with substance use. He has been in and out of the criminal system for a variety of reasons, including OWIs and disorderly conduct charges. He has been drinking and partying in the music scene since he was in his teens. He has probation and court requirements that he consistently ignores as he spends most of his time using or recovering from daily binge drinking. He does not work and has been creative in finding ways to obtain alcohol. What dosing activities might be of interest to Robert? What sort of sensory experiences might Robert be missing?
Probably relationships that are positive.
Yep, positive relationships. Being in his body, I imagine being drunk, that he's out of his body a lot and not rooted in the real world. And so a lot of grounding activities that would include things like yoga stretches. It would include things like breathing techniques, anything to bring folks back into the present moment might be of interest. It sounds like a strength of his is music, so we might want to capitalize on music as a dosing activity for Robert. Any other ideas based on this little scenario?
Doesn't sound like he has any goals in life.
Yeah, so how could we use dosing to increase his engagement with creating goals? Because creating goals comes up here, from up here. And right now it sounds like Robert's really working and jamming back here. So how could we build up that capacity for him to be in relationships?
Well, he seems to be quite creative in finding ways to obtain alcohol, so maybe that creativity could be used in some other activity. Maybe finding food for homeless people or something.
Yeah, to give him some purpose, right? To give him a direction, to give him something that other people depend on him for. That's a great idea. I love that. I wish Robert was real. I would want to bring that suggestion to him.
Maybe researching and finding some other hobbies too for himself. And maybe that's co-regulatory, so he's not going to search for you know, creatively getting alcohol, but working with somebody on if he likes or dislikes something that he can
Mhm.
trust.
Yeah, really finding his interests. I think that is part of creating some people's dosing schedules, is helping them even find what they like. Because we saw some of our trauma responses lead us to not having an identity of our own and really knowing ourselves well enough to know what we like and what we don't like. So part of that dosing process could be doing that discovery and that exploration to then come up with something that the individual is going to engage with. They're going to do it consistently, and they're going to do it in a way that eventually does that brain repair that we're looking for. So I see we're over a little bit, and I apologize. At the end of all of it, it's a message that trauma can really substantially affect us, both in our brains, the way we think, the way we relate to people and see the world, and in our physical bodies. And folks have really non-effective ways and creative ways of keeping themselves safe and secure, but when they're given the tools to truly repair their trauma at the body and brain level, it really, I have seen it move people from just surviving to being able to thrive. And that's what we want for our community members. And that's what we want for our systems, is for folks to feel more safe, more often in their bodies. And so hopefully you've learned a little bit today about why that's important and how to support folks in starting those changes and starting that repair and that recovery process. These are my resources here, and please feel free, my email address is there. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions or comments or concerns or observations or just anything you want to share. I'm free, I'm available to do that. So I would love to offer. And I want to thank you for having me.
Well, Cory, thank you very much for your presentation. You know, Mental Health Month is to make people a little bit more aware of this issue, be aware of it, and hopefully do something to better themselves or people that they have contact with. And the kind of information you gave us here today really can give people an understanding of that hidden person that they see out there. Just about everybody has something in their background of some sort that affects them. You know, they could have a bad day just because of not sleeping well at night, like you said, or because of an abusive spouse, for instance, and you just don't know. So you should treat everybody fairly well, and if they need that help, you know, lend them a hand and pull them forward and support them and do all those things. But you know, some people like, you know, Tracy, that deals with somebody in their life that's really traumatized. It's so hard, and I'm sure Tracy's had a lot of exposure to ways to try to deal with her child, but some parents don't. And the help is out there. Like I said, we're a real resource-rich community, but too many people don't know how to navigate it or to find these resources. I mean, they could call 211. I think the county are they using a sort of a hub system or a one-point entry system to try to make sure people are handed off to the right people. Things are changing, and that's because of the stigma of mental health being lessened a little bit more every year. But we have a long way to go, real long way. But when we get people like you to share this, it's really helpful. So thanks again.
I appreciate being asked. It was a real honor. Thank you.
I'll thank Donna for finding you. I don't know if she's still on. I don't see her. She had to maybe drop off, but I'm glad that she located you and asked you to speak. Anyone else have any questions for Cory or any comments?
I just want to thank you for offering the recommendations on the dosing, and I'll probably be wanting that resource to work with the families and people I work with, because a lot of times by the time I'm sitting with a parent, we've done that, we've tried that, we've been there, and I have that discussion, but it'd be great to have that, you know, content and evidence base or whatever you can give me in my hands would be super helpful of why we try it again or look for another direction. So yeah, it's more than people think. It's not just, oh yeah, I know how to do that, I can handle that, but how often do you do it every day? And I'm so happy you touched on that.
I'm glad that resonated with you, and I definitely can send you those resources. So we'll get that accomplished. I'll put it on my to-do list for tomorrow.
Thanks.
Anyone else have any comments or thoughts?
Well, I just want to say, Cory, that in my experiences within my own family, I never heard the word dosing. We talked about coping skills, but I think referring to it as dosing as a therapeutic medical, treatment response is really appropriate. And I like the fact, the list is there and the prescribed times that you do it, because it's almost like, oh, just do this once a day or something, and then you'll be okay. And I think that adds another dimension to this whole issue of dealing with trauma and working through a recovery program for people. I guess we learn more with each year. I wish I'd have known some of these things a couple of years ago, but it's good to know them now.
Same. As an early practitioner, I wish I would have known more about this, because I got a lot of trauma experience early on, but there wasn't a lot of the evidence-based kind of things to back up what I had been doing early on in my career, or knowing early on in my career. And so I appreciate that comment that we are getting closer to seeing this as like prescriptive in some ways, but still very individualized and as strengths-based as we can be. So yeah, we're learning a lot every year, and there's more to learn. I don't know that we'll ever know everything we can know about the human brain and how we protect ourselves, but there's a wealth of research and a lot of researchers out there now doing this work. So I'm not the only source. There's lots of sources out there, and so I encourage you to keep looking, keep learning, keep using, keep knowing. It's important to our field. So thanks.
And I really appreciate that you refer to it as a brain injury, because I think that's what, will help people in their recovery, because it's just like if you have a heart injury, or if you have, kidney problem or something like that,
Yeah.
the brain can be damaged and injured, and you have to treat it and you have to make it well again.
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't think enough people, it's just like, oh, you're damaged. We use all our fun mental health stigma labels for people without really understanding that this isn't something that is willfully happening. It's something that their brain has constructed itself to do in order to exist in the world. And that is a brain injury. That's an injury to the brain that wouldn't otherwise have occurred, and is leaving an impact on functioning. And so, yes, I very much stand on the soapbox of trauma being a brain injury.
Well, thank you for all you do and for spreading your message.
Okay. Anyone else have any comments? Okay. Again, Cory, thank you so much for your information. It's very necessary for people to really know these things to function better and work with people better. So remember, next week we do have the School District of La Crosse on social and emotional learning. If you have friends that you want to have watch this, they can go to our website and see the recorded version of Cory and any of our other presentations. So people need help, they can reach out, and hopefully we can get them directed to the right resources. So again, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us tonight.